No. Right, I'm just going to click go live now. Okay, we're good to go.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Just a little bit of housework. If you want to ask a question, please leave it until after Ali has spoken. You can use the chat room or the participants room in the bottom right-hand corner to raise your electric hand. Can you also please change to make a change on your iPads, laptops, iPhones to your first name or second name or both? We look at it as a very serious security, and we have problems to go. We have problems. So if you go into the participant part that you don't know about, and you go into the top right-hand box and you change the name. So I'd like to see all them change quickly. At the end of the evening, we will demute all of us, if anyone's left, and have a chat. And now David Lando next to me, we'll mute all of us and have a very good chat. David has promised to bring in a very, very expensive malt bottle. So now we'll just go to right. Ali Drabu is a Muslim student and a graduate of the Stand With Us at Emerson Fellowship's program 2019 and 2020. He's a recent graduate from the University of St Andrews in international relations, and is currently undertaking a master's degree in international security at King's College London. Ali is also a former member of Youth Parliament, with his work focusing on campaigning against Semitism, Anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. So over to Ali.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you so much to Edgware United Synagogue for having me, and for all of you for coming. I'm genuinely quite chuffed to see so many of you. And obviously, I wish this could be something that I was doing in person and to meet all of you. But nevertheless, I'm glad that I've got the chance to speak to you all today and kind of tell you a little bit about my journey. And I just want to kind of lay a couple of sort of disclaimers before the event that kind of everything I'm going to talk about today is based off my own personal experience and my own story. I don't represent, the views or opinions of any particular organization or group of individuals. And obviously today, please don't feel like anything's off limits for questions. I would love to have some of the most challenging questions from the audience and as possible. But anyway, just to kind of give you a little bit more of a personal background to who I am and myself. So I'm from Manchester in the UK, and my family is originally from Indian administered Kashmir, which, if you don't know, is a contested region in South Asia between India and Pakistan. I've grown up as a Muslim, and in a sense, I would say that my faith is something that has definitely had a big factor on my upbringing, and my value basis and my general outlook. And you're probably thinking, how does somebody of this background become engaged with or come to sort of see, discuss, and challenge this overall picture when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is largely what I'm here to talk about today. And I think really it stems from growing up as a young Muslim. You hear about sort of Palestine, Palestinians, the brotherhood in a sense that is talked about in a very communal sense, and the necessity that lies to support sort of in the duty of supporting your Muslim brothers. And that is something that I think very, very young age. And it was something that got me interested, to say the least, within sort of international affairs. And obviously, being a Kashmiri and seeing sort of my own homeland, in a sense, being engulfed by political conflict and the difficulties that existed there. I think it was something that when I started to really engage with this issue, it made me think a lot about it and kind of draw parallels between the conflict that was happening between Israelis and the Palestinians and Kashmiris. And in that sense, I became quite emotionally attached to the issue, and kind of bringing that forward. As I kind of grew into my teenage years, I obviously became more and more engaged politically. And this was a cause that I became really, really passionate about. But when I say that, I think it was something that was much more of an emotive stance as well. And particularly in 2014, when the Israel-Gaza war happened, in Operation Protective Edge, I kind of took those passions into activism. And I became part of the Palestine Solidarity campaign in Manchester, actively partook in the demonstrations. For those of you who kind of knew anything about the demonstrations in Manchester, the protests basically involved actively boycotting businesses that were deemed to be linked to or supporting Israel. They got really heated at one point. There's a shop here in the city centre, Kadem, which I believe sells Israeli beauty products, that was kind of the flashpoint between protesters. On both sides, you had the kind of the pro-Palestinian and the pro-Israeli protesters on either side, sort of shouting and screaming at each other in the most eloquent of fashion, of course. But I think that, as somebody that, as a teenager, and you kind of, when you're holding your banner and your flag and you're in that crowd, you do get a sense of excitement and a real buzz about it, and you really feel like this is doing something. And thinking back now, even to kind of those days, and it seems like so long ago, but even thinking back to that particular time period, and when I kind of think about what I was wanting to achieve and what I was there for, I almost couldn't give an answer in a way, and I almost find it hard to. And I guess it's the nature of protest movements in a way, thinking about the people that I was surrounded by. It was obviously myself, but I was surrounded by different people with a lot of different viewpoints. And I think one of the most frustrating things, and what really began to kind of chink away at this mentality that I'd been raised with, was engaging with discussions with people on sort of Israel-Palestine, and that discussion lingering into language which became accepting of and tolerant of bigotry and prejudice, and particularly anti-Semitism, which was something that I became extremely frustrated about, and obviously, having done work in the youth parliament trying to combat this, this was something that I became increasingly more aware of, and I was noticing. And sometimes it wasn't necessarily intentional. That's the thing. And that's the thing that was almost the most frustrating about it, was you're trying to have a discussion about sort of the tendencies of the conflict and others, and people alluding to basically what are age-old anti-Semitic tropes, this idea of the nefarious Jews controlling sort of, the media and the world and the bank. And it really angered me in a way. But at the same time, obviously I was there for what I believed was the same cause as these people, was to protest against the injustices that were taking place there. But at the same time, that was something I couldn't condone. But anyway, more moving on from that. So, 2014, I have this, and I, by this point as well, I should say, I was someone that would identify quite openly as anti-Zionist. For me, I didn't necessarily see any distinction between sort of, what I fundamentally believe was anti-Zionism was a perfectly legitimate political belief to hold. And it was something that I thought was acceptable, and it was something that I actively promoted. And now reflecting back on that, and kind of having done the work that I've done as well, it makes me think twice, and almost to think back at that particular time of where that was something that I saw as acceptable is quite startling. But anyway, where did this all change? Where did I finally sort of see the light, if you like? So I was really fortunate that in my school, I had the school that I attended, my secondary school, had a travel award scheme, where students were able to submit a project proposal of sort to travel to a particular region of the world due to a subjective interest they may have. And at this point, I was pretty set that I was going to be studying something political at university. And I said, I'm going to apply. I'm going to travel to Israel and the West Bank. And everybody was like, you are crazy. There is no way you're going to do this. And at this point, I was 17 years old. So it was quite startling for many people. And, for me, at this point, I had been politically really involved on the issue. I had been on the demonstrations. I'd sparred with, pro-Israeli supports for Palestinians, I'd engaged in the discussions, and I'd felt this was the chance for me to actually go and see it on the ground. This was a chance for me to truly engage with this and actually hear from the people who live this conflict day in and day out. And, I was really lucky. I won the award. I was given a grant by my school to go and travel. And I got to see, in this particular trip, I went for 2 weeks, and I got to travel across the West Bank to all the major Palestinian cities. And I got to see a lot of Israel too. And I think really to summarize the trip is what I realized is there are many, many layers to this particular conflict that media headlines and sort of campaign slogans cannot begin to capture. And, for me, it was really the opportunity to hear the stories of people and their histories in relation to this, someone that grew up in sort of a Muslim household and with the background that I had, I never really heard the story of the Jewish people and Israelis who'd come there, and actually, people who had family members who, had survived the Holocaust, who had come after that many years of persecution and ended up there. For me, that was a real eye opener. It was something that I had never really appreciated to begin with, but that was something that really, really opened my eyes. And even spending time in the West Bank, with the Palestinians and the Palestinian cities was also another experience. And, it finally, it gave me a sense of conscience that I was seeking to understand the narratives of both people and their stories. I got the chance to meet people from across the spectrum. I met people, Palestinians who were involved in political activities with Hamas, to kind of, your liberal, happy-go-lucky, Tel Aviv residents. So it really showed the complexity and the diversity of this particular issue. And I guess in a first instance, whilst that in a sense almost broke down my initial kind of conceptions about this conflict, which, in 2014, we're kind of the mentality that, this is a black and white issue, that there is one good side and there is one bad side. Israel is in the wrong, Palestine is in the right. That kind of shattered that mentality to some degree. And it exposed a much deeper intricacy. And I think that really motivated me to kind of continue on this pathway and, in a sense, continue within sort of this work of activism that I was doing. And I was really fortunate as well that this wasn't the first and last time that I went to Israel. I got to go again in 2017. In fact, that was probably one even more of an experience in that I got to travel with a really close Jewish friend of mine. We were both kind of became friends in my first year of university. He was from New York. We had diametrically opposing views on the conflict. And, one day I just said, let's go. And we basically planned out the trip. And it was actually such a unique experience to have, again, being exposed to those deeper narratives, but even in a fashion which understood even better the mentality from which people were coming from. I managed to, with a lot of persuasion, take him to many cities in the West Bank to meet some of the Palestinian friends that I had made. And for him, it was such an eye-opening experience too. And I think at the end of the day, we're not going to agree on every single principle and every single intricate aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. I mean, that was something that I wasn't seeking to achieve, but what I was really happy about and what I was almost grateful for was the fact that there was a creation of an environment where we could appreciate each other's differences, understand that we're both human beings, and understand that both sides, in a sense, are human and have their own histories, their own stories too. And then my final trip, with my most recent trip, was 2018, where I spent time volunteering in Hebron on the Palestinian side of the city, where I was teaching English and learning Arabic in a Palestinian school. And but in a sense, bringing this all back to really life here in the UK as a student. I mean, it goes without saying that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is probably one of the most toxic issues that exists on student campuses today. And it's not simply down to the fact that the issue itself is complicated, but more to the fact that the way in which certain groups have conducted themselves and the activities which they perpetuate often lead to the intimidation, in some cases violence towards other students. And many students, and particularly Jewish students, who feel often targeted, marginalized by certain activities that are conducted by self-proclaimed pro-Palestinian organizations. And I had a lot of friends who were at UK universities, and some of whom partook very, very heavily within this field of kind of activism. And I think some of the stories that I would hear were quite harrowing. During the Israel Apartheid week, I heard of how Jewish students had fake blood sort of thrown on them, and it just made me think. And I was like, hold on a second, how does that, in a sense, achieve any sort of betterment, fulfillment, alleviation of suffering for Palestinians in the West Bank, to do that to students in the UK? And it really sort of started to shake up more this kind of preconceptions that I'd had, the activism that I'd partaken in, and sort of made me question, really, why was I doing this? At the end of the day, what I was seeking to achieve was never the delegitimization or the destruction of another people, of another state. What I wanted to achieve was peace. And I believed that peace, in that particular mindset, going back to my 2014 self, if you like, was achieved through activism, protest, boycotts, others. And I think, especially now, that has radically shifted. But carrying on with sort of what I was saying about UK universities and others, what I realized as well, and what it really reminded me of, was hearing about sort of the difficult relationships that a lot of students had with certain organizations. I know for a fact that there was, I won't name the university or the individuals at all, but I know that at certain universities, there was a very difficult relationship between Jewish societies and the Islamic societies. And the main sticking point was the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. The ISOC was sympathetic to the BDS movement and others, and the JSOC were obviously against most of that, because they felt completely targeted and basically ostracized by the activities that they were undertaking. And I think it made me think back actually to my time in Hebron, where I remember waiting for the bus going back to Jerusalem one day, and I looked over at a road, and I remember seeing on either side, it's probably a quite picturesque moment, but you had your Jewish Israelis on one side of the road, just walking, carrying on with their business. And there was a group of Palestinian kids playing football on the other side. And just thinking, and these guys, and they weren't even that far apart. This road wasn't huge. It wasn't like a highway. It was quite a small road that, you could quite easily talk to somebody at the other side. As those Israelis walked past, and as those Palestinian kids playing football, it's like neither was there to each other. It's like they did not acknowledge each other's existence at all. Those Jewish Israelis carried on walking. Those Palestinian kids had their heads down, playing football. There wasn't even a look up. There wasn't even an acknowledgement of that other person's existence. And I think, just bringing that back to what I was saying, is that I would say the most toxic elements of this conflict, the segregation of two peoples, incitement, hatred, these things have leaked into the contemporary discourse on campuses in the UK on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it is a shame, and it is a genuine shame that this is something that has poisoned an issue that, by and large, and realistically speaking, that it will not be students on UK campuses that solve this issue. It will not be those people. It will be people within that respective land who come together eventually to find a resolution. And ultimately marginalizing, bullying, harassing those who do not agree with you, who do not share your perspective on certain issues, is never the solution. And this last year, in our sort of pre-COVID world, I was lucky that I had the opportunity to take the stand with us, Emerson Fellowship. And I had a lot of sort of, I had heard of Stand With Us previously. I knew who the organization were. Coming from the background that I had, my perceptions of the organization were very negative. And it's fair to say that I had a lot of worries going into the program. But I was very lucky that I had two members of staff who led the program that were extremely tolerant and open-minded, and actually wanted to create an environment for me in which I was able to actually express my own viewpoints, which again were different to those on the program. And ultimately create an environment where I wasn't going to be sidelined for who I was, but also not jeopardize my own sort of personal, like I said, reputation or kind of my own safety, if you like. And I think that, one of the things I worried about the most was, in a sense, is what would the reception be? What would people say if they found out I was doing this whole thing with Sam with us all, but you're working for this pro-Israel organization, this lobby group? And I didn't see it like that, and I never did. And so I'm going to explain why. So I was the only Muslim student who partook in the UK Emerson Fellowship program. And I never saw that as a limitation or as a problem. I think actually one of the things that I was really proud to have done was to kind of break an echo chamber that many of the students said that they had previously experienced when they'd come into spaces like this to discuss the issues that we were discussing. We were talking about things like Israel, Zionism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Judaism, others, all of these things that were being discussed, and I sought to kind of act as, in some level, a counterweight, sometimes even a devil's advocate, if you like. And, for me, whilst it was obviously difficult, on a personal level, to often try and challenge the group thing, sometimes many, a shared mentality, one thing it gave me the reassurance of was that actually, the effort that I was putting in, if I wasn't in that room, those people would not have been exposed to that alternative viewpoint. I tried to talk a lot about the time that I spent in the West Bank, for example, with the individuals that I was with. I talked about my own experiences of engaging with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all of these other things. And for many people, for them, it did open their eyes to another narrative. And I think that, incrementally, whilst it wasn't something that, tomorrow will resolve the entire issue, I think it provides a step according to which of dialogue and an atmosphere and kind of an atmosphere of peace can be fostered. And that was something for me that really motivated me to continue through the program. Whilst I knew that this was an organization that had a bad reputation, difficulties in others in my own community, it was something that I was really glad to have at least done. And, obviously, the Emerson Fellowship itself is a program where, students are basically leaders on their campus, work to kind of provide Israel education, combat anti-Semitism. I was very lucky, actually, at my own university in St. Andrews. I'd never had to deal with anything of that nature in a very difficult sense. That the campus that I was at, the individuals whom I associated with, there were never any serious incidents of anti-Semitic dialogue, of Islamophobia, of toxic political discourse. That didn't exist. And that was something that I was really happy about. And it made my experience a lot simpler. But, traveling to other cities, seeing my friends in Leeds, Manchester, others, where the atmosphere was different, it really, really shocked me in a way. But anyway, moving on, kind of discussing about the Emerson Fellowship, and, one of the perhaps, I guess, stellar moments was attending the Stand With Us conference in Los Angeles. And that was in January 2020. That was a really eye-opening moment. If I had to guess, there were probably 300-400 people, maybe more. And I was the only Muslim there. And I remember people asking me kind of, are you comfortable? Do you feel okay with that? And for me, I never really considered it in a way. My response was just no. And I think that in that respect, I always like to teach myself that actually your identity and your own characteristics should never be something that holds you back. And, as a Muslim, one of the things that I recognize on a religious basis is, the many commonalities that I share and that Muslims share with Jews. My dad and I always joke how, Jews to us are our religious cousins. And, there are many theological aspects and, even cultural aspects that I would say are so similar. And in that respect, it almost drove me further and pushed me further within this work that I was doing to continue to try and foster this dialogue of peace, to work towards progression in achieving peace within this particular conflict, to kind of separate it away from this notion that Jews and Muslims have to be fighting one another because of what was going on in the Middle East, but actually overlook that and build bridges according to the commonalities. So, the international conference itself was a very unique experience. And bringing together sort of students from all over the world, many of whom had very, very strong ties to Israel, had done a lot of pro-Israel work on their campuses. And there were a lot of educational discussions and seminars and others, but I think the most eye-opening aspects, again, for me in that particular conference was just simply having those one-on-one discussions with different participants and others. Not in a formal setting, but just simply in passing. You'd be, be going to lunch, for example, and I'd be sat on a table with, a student from Texas, Florida, New York, wherever it might have been, and just talking about the issues and, again, relaying our own backgrounds, laying our cards on the table and simply just playing the game. And, for me, again, I was really happy that going into those discussions that, again, I was listened to, I was respected, and I was never pushed out or made to feel uncomfortable. And, I figured that this was something that in a different environment, a different setting would not have been possible. And again, the discussions I had with many of the students there, we weren't always going to agree on everything. And again, this isn't about universal agreement, universal consensus. This is about a sharing of ideas. And it reminded me of a TED talk that was done by, the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who said, "It's the people not like us who make us grow." And for me, that message really stuck with me as I was kind of working through these 3 days in Los Angeles in this conference with students who, again, were so different to who I was. In a sense, I left the conference with a very, very mixed sort of set of emotions. On the one side, I was almost frustrated that this wasn't happening more, that this kind of atmosphere of people engaging with each other was not more universal, that, whilst I was one kind of drop in the ocean of a variety of students who, by and large, shared the same opinions of the same backgrounds, I wished I wasn't simply a drop, but more like a bucket of water coming into this. I really wish that it was in a greater amount. But at the same time, I was hopeful. And I was hopeful in the sense that, having engaged these discussions with different students, having spoken to them, having shared our ideas, that it actually created a prospect that peace could be achieved. That, there is an opportunity for people to understand one another. And that's all I sought in the end. That peace for me, instead of what it was, which in my previous mind was about sort of, fighting it in the way of activism and boycotts and aggression, became more about an understanding. And that for me really was the key lesson from this all. That, as my background, as with my background as somebody that was heavily involved to a large degree with the BDS movement and actively promoted it, to kind of transitioning to this particular moment now where I fundamentally believe that it's actually not about that in a sense, peace can only be built through cohesive partnerships and understanding each other, is something that I had learned through a lot of this whole journey. And, that the end of the Emerson Fellowship sort of culminated in me writing an article in the Times of Israel, which is, I believe, how Edgeware United Synagogue found me. And I think that, that was something for me, that was a big step as well. And, I was quite anxious, again, to write my feelings and my experiences down and in a public sphere, fearing the backlash, fearing what could have happened. And actually, when that was released, I was overwhelmed by the reception, because on the one side, it was like, everybody was being extremely kind, saying, how great of a job it was, and, how moved they felt by the work that I'd done. But at the same time, I wasn't sort of criminalized for what I had written. I wasn't seen as an outcast. I wasn't seen as that traitor or others. And for me, that was something that was reassuring again. And I was quite confident that I believe, and to this day I believe, that mentalities are changing. And it's something that I'm hopeful for into the future. And, student activism is something that I think has a lot of merits in some respects. And, I don't believe that students are all, and people who kind of engage with this activism, I should say, are people who are innately bigoted, prejudiced, racist. I believe that at the end of the day, people ultimately all want the same thing at the end of the day, which is a sense of peace, justice for all sorts of people. Perhaps I'm being optimistic, but at the same time, I think with that mentality and with that shared mentality of building that peace, I think we can actually work towards a solution and work towards a genuine peace for peoples. And yeah, I think that's basically what I wanted to talk on. And I understand I probably undershot time there a little bit. But no, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. And I'm more than happy to take any questions from anybody in the audience as well.
David, I'm trying to unmute you.
Yeah, am I? Yeah, I'm not. I'm
Unmuted.
That was. I don't know what to call it. You know, because the funny thing, we being Jewish, unfortunately, really, that we don't mix with you. Not intentionally, but you know, you go your ways, we go our ways, and you don't look like a Muslim. I think you're more like Jewish. So if you're ready to convert, one day. But I don't know where to start actually. When and why did you get into BDS, and how did you feel, and how did your families and friends when you turned around and you said, "I'm joining BDS"?
Yeah. So how I got into the BDS movement?
Because obviously, when we hear BDS, we look at them as Nazis. You know, all we feel is they want to kill us or not make our lives happy.
Yeah.
You know, it's a shock. You know, do you think
I understand, and I think, I mean, where I came to be involved in it was, I mean, logistically speaking, I became involved. I would kind of became through social media. I got in contact with kind of the local Palestinian solidarity campaign and sort of started carrying out work from there. I guess why I got involved was, I think it was because of the fact that I was angry at what I saw or what I perceived was going on at the time. I was angry at the kind of injustices that I believed in. I was angry at the fact that, you know, I believed that people were being oppressed. And in that respect, I felt that I wanted to do something. And I understand that there is sort of, you know, perception perhaps that BDS are sort of this collective of individuals that, you know, and I will say it quite clearly, you know, BDS, the problem I have with it is that it provides a platform to individuals that will often allude to anti-Semitic rhetoric, will engage in anti-Semitic rhetoric actively. You know, the movement itself, the stated aims are, you know, to make Israel meet its obligations under international law, which itself is not anti-Semitic. And that for me isn't the problem. The problem is some of the individuals within that movement. And I think that the problem that the movement has suffered from is a failure to effectively clamp down on that. And actually have a zero tolerance policy towards it. You know, there's, you know, if you want to talk about policy, you know, talk about Israeli government policy being problematic, that isn't the problem. But when you start saying, you know, the fact that people saying things like British Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the UK, that is a huge, big red flag where I'm like, nope, that is not acceptable. And the minute you start kind of entertaining and dancing with that rhetoric, it becomes very, very problematic. You know, it reminds me of a discussion I had with a friend of mine just recently after Keir Starmer got elected leader, and it was after the murder of George Floyd, where Rebecca Long Bailey had shared an article or something of some sort that basically alluded to the Israeli police training the US police to do that, basically alluding to the fact that Israel had somehow been responsible for George Floyd's death. And, you know, Starmer basically, you know, he removed Long Bailey from a position, and, you know, my friend was like, oh, that's, you know, Keir Starmer's pandering, it's not a good move, it's dangerous. And I said, look, I'm happier that he's taken the zero tolerance approach towards it, because for a long, long time, a lot of people have simply accepted or kind of been like, oh, it's not really a big deal. No. The minute you start delving into bigotry is the minute you need to be stopped. Very, very plain and simple. There should be no ifs or buts about that. And that is something that I got quite frustrated with certain members of the BDS movement, that there was a simple acceptance that you can use slurs like Zio and others, and that can be acceptable. That was very frustrating to me, because again, you know, again, I don't believe that that is every member of the movement, but I am going to say that the movement itself needs to, or has some serious questions to ask itself when it deals with the rhetoric and addresses, you know, and well, I should say the way it kind of should make the distinguish between Jews and Israel. That is a problem of the movement itself, I would say.
Mm. How did your family and friends thought about what happened? I mean, was it like, you know, I'm a Muslim now, okay, now I'm BDS, and tomorrow I won't be Jewish, but I got, you know, I went from you know, anti to, I don't know how, well, you must have been anti-Jewish, obviously, at that time. And it sort of,
Yeah.
what did your family and friends and so on, they must have been shocked, weren't they?
Actually, no, I think my family have always been incredibly supportive of the work that I've done. I wouldn't say I was ever, I never ever saw myself as anti-Jewish, 100%. I never believed myself to be someone that was against Jews. And I think that in a sense, I've been lucky because, you know, I've grown up here and I've, you know, a lot of my, you know, even now my closest friends from university have been Jewish and others, you know, I've been lucky that, you know, my family have been extremely supportive of the work that I've done. And in a good sense that obviously, you know, there might be disagreements over certain political aspects, but mostly focus on the different issues as opposed to the wider sort of, you know, mentality. But, you know, my family themselves, you know, my mother used to work in Prestwich, and, you know, she had some very, very good, you know, she always was somebody that told me about, you know, especially when I was brought up religiously, was always about tolerance. And my upbringing has never been dogma, you know, kind of to preach dogma, to preach bigotry, or to kind of, you know, encourage separatism. It's always been about inclusivity. And that's something that I'm very lucky to have had, and I'm very grateful for in a sense. I think some of my friends were a little bit more taken aback. You know, I had sort of individuals said I was a traitor, I was a sellout. And to be honest, at that point, it really showed kind of their own character. And, you know, I wasn't fazed by it. I wasn't put off by the work that I did. You know, I knew my own conscience. I knew my own ground. You know, I knew kind of who I was and the views that I had, and what I was trying to achieve. And I knew that that was something that ultimately was for the better. And I kind of just remained steadfast throughout the process, I would say.
How did your parents look at Jews? Obviously, when you became more Jewish.
Again,
sorry,
you know,
can I sort of
yeah.
First of all, what do they think of going into BDS? And secondly, you know, what you're doing now.
So it's quite funny. You know how you said before that I look Jewish. It's something that my dad sort of has the same thing, and I think that in a sense, talking about sort of how my family view, my parents, you know, again, they've never been, I'd say, I wouldn't say they've been very political, really. Again, what they've always kind of wanted, I would say, and what they've always encouraged is that, you know, the work I'm doing is for something that's for the greater good, if you like. You know, again, we've had, you know, Jewish friends for many, many years. We've been, in a sense, whilst we've tried to engage with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you know, we've always sought to do it in a way that never ever entertained the bigotry, never entertained any form of discrimination or language that was anti-Semitic. I mean, when I joined sort of the BDS movement, I guess it was more a time of, you know, look, you know, do the work you're doing. Just, I think that honestly, they were more, their priority was more for me getting on with my exams and GCSEs and getting to university at that point. But again, there was never really a shock. There was never a moment for them where they were kind of disgusted or like outraged or disappointed. There was never that. There was always, you know, a tenet of support behind me. And, you know, it was something that they were always receptive to. And, you know, again, I bring it back to my own religious upbringing. You know, I have always been taught about kind of, you know, the merits that both Islam and Judaism have shared, the commonalities, the shared histories. And that is something that I have been lucky to have had.
Yeah. We've actually got some family up there, or sort of, in, I think it's called Liverpool. So I'm inviting them to have a word. You may not understand what they're saying, but if they Don't seem to be. Oh, he's come in, Victor. Hold on. They can't hear you. Can you demute him? He's not.
Sorry, David, who are you trying to bring in?
Well, there's Victor and Josh. They're both sitting next to you.
Bring in Howard Youngerwood, who's been waiting a while.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll bring Howard in first.
Yeah.
Jump in afterwards, Victor.
Howard, your line's open.
Yeah, Ali, thank you very much. I have this question because you can be perhaps more objective than us neurotic Jews. You've been for some years now speaking to basically supporters of the Palestinian cause as a general group. You said basically yourself that when you joined BDS, you were never against basically Jews or particularly the rights of Israel to exist. So my question is this. When you've been speaking to these supporters of the Palestinian cause, to what extent, and it's a general view, to what extent have you formed the view that there is a real acceptance of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in its ancient homeland? That's, of course, very different from a realistic perspective. Israel is here to stay, where you don't for one moment necessarily accept the right to be there. So what's your take on that as a general view?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question, Howard. It's really interesting. I think it's one of the difficulties, I think, of kind of the acceptance of Israel. And, you know, I like how you make the distinction between kind of the Israel is there to stay versus Israel's right to exist. I think that the difficulty is a lack of understanding of Jewish history in the first instance. And the fact that many people kind of, when Zionism is talked about, it is often a dirty word. It's misunderstood to some level. I think that the history is not well spoken enough about. And I think that, you know, that is something that I think, you know, bringing people together in kind of, you know, dialogue forums and others is the opportunity to actually build that and understand that. I think that often it's a mixed reception. I think, you know, for myself and others at the time, you know, it was never about the destruction of Israel. It was never about promoting that. It was never about advocating for that. It was always about, you know, bridging that, you know, that two-state mentality, you know, the idea that, you know, if we put economic pressure and political pressure and others on Israel through boycotts, etc., that, you know, they will come to meet the obligations under international law, etc. That, I think, is, you know, I'd find it very difficult to quantify that at the moment for you. And I'm not going to sit here and say that all BDS supporters are wanting the destruction of Israel versus all BDS supporters are two-staters. It's very difficult. And I think that that's something that will vary according to demographics. I think in the UK, I would say that the discourse is a lot less toxic than in the US, where I think that this issue in particular is, especially when it comes to kind of discussing Jews and Zionism, you know, it's much harder to have that discussion. But I think, again, acceptance of Israel's right to exist and others will come through those who kind of narrate their history. And I think that it is, you know, I almost implore those who can, and particularly, you know, Jews in this country and, you know, Jewish students who are my age to talk about it. And I think that that's something that is often, you know, looked down on, it's ignored. And I think that in some cases you have to be vocal about it and you have to be, you know, honest about your own roots. And I think that, you know, that is one of the merits of JSOCs, in that they actually foster the opportunities for Jewish students to kind of experience their history, talk about their history. And I think that eventually, you know, that will kind of create that understanding of people who are supporting the Palestinian cause, that Israel does have a right to exist too.
I just want to jump in. You're obviously the exception rather than the rule, where people generally in society take one view and don't try to look at both sides, even down to basic football fans who go along to a football match and will follow their own team, but not actually consider that actually it's a good game between two teams. They don't look at the football, they look at the teams. Coming back to the discussion point on BDS, you've talked about it as obviously not purchasing Israeli goods and so on and so forth. How do people who support BDS believe that helps the Palestinians?
Mm-hmm. I guess it's okay. So why did, in a sense, what you're asking is why do BDS supporters believe that okay? I guess it kind of, I have to bring it back for you, which is, the history of it a little bit, which is that, the BDS movement itself kind of takes its model of economic sanctions, economic boycotts and others of the South Africa boycott movement, which is basically the idea that, again, that through kind of economic pressure and others, that the apartheid movement was brought to an end through that, which again, I would argue is a bit of a selective view of history. It's a little bit, it doesn't fully appreciate kind of the wider global response to apartheid, which was slightly different. But I think that's the basic tenet of it. The basic idea is the Israeli government doesn't want to listen. The only solution is basically, to actually kind of force them to make a maneuver. I mean, the reason why, another reason, I guess, why I'm also kind of not very supportive of it is because actually there are instances where the boycott, the BDS movement, I should say, has actually harmed Palestinians. So, SodaStream had a factory in the West Bank that pulled out, and 5,000 Palestinian jobs were lost, and that's livelihoods gone. The efficiency of it is definitely questionable. And sort of if we say that the BDS movement has really been around since the 1990s, if you like, if we look at the time frame in which that's existed, you've had Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Jordan, all normalize and have kind of substantial trading and economic relationships with Israel. It's falling apart. And actually, I think that the BDS movement itself is not going to be championed by Palestinians on the ground. It's not going to be something that the Palestinians themselves actually promote. It's going to be something that people, kind of sort of students, academics within sort of the Western Hemisphere actively try and maintain to kind of continue to push this cause forward. And I think that itself is a problem.
Just on another score, when you were traveling between Israel and the Palestinian territories, how were you treated on both sides? Were there issues because you were moving from one to another? And what were you it's a difficult question, but what were you regarded as? How were you looked upon? How were you treated? And did you find any difficulty in moving around?
I'm really glad you asked this question. This is probably what I can't believe I missed this out. Traveling between. So first off, I was extremely lucky. I had a British passport. I could go wherever I wanted. Nothing was obviously aside from Gaza, but that's because for a whole host of reasons. And again, I think entering Gaza would have been extremely difficult and probably not the safest. But anyway, traveling between the two. So traveling into the West Bank and kind of the Palestinian territories was never ever a problem. My name is Ali. And instantly, it kind of, when I speak to people there, they're like, "What's your name?" I say, "I'm Ali," and they're like, "Oh, you're Muslim." They're like, "Welcome." They're very, very welcoming and very hospitable to me. And I think, honestly, even while I went on like tour groups with other people, they are, to everybody. It wasn't just to me, but even across kind of to tourists who came from the US, from like Switzerland and others. They were very, very welcoming and hospitable, and that is something that I, in all the time that I have been there, I cannot ignore and I cannot overstate. I've been there 3 times and I have, good friends there now to this day. They have always been incredibly caring, have looked after me, while I've stayed there. Again, incredibly hospitable and kind of receptive people, I would say. And that's something that, I wish was kind of seen a little bit more. And, when I was there, some people thought I was Palestinian. Some people thought I was Arab or Turkish or Iranian. And then on the other side, when I was in Israel, I kind of got the best of both worlds, because in some cases I was seen as Israeli. I would be in Tel Aviv and people would start speaking Hebrew to me, and I was just like, sorry, I don't speak Hebrew. But, in that respect, it was nice to kind of be welcomed. The only sort of people who really caught me out were the security personnel. And, landing in Ben Gurion Airport as a 17-year-old was an interesting experience, being called aside and sort of questioned by 3 huge guys who were, angry and Israeli and probably thinking, why the hell is this kid rocked up here? What is he doing here anyway? That was an experience in itself, being questioned by, the Israeli security. That is something that I definitely noticed was harder. And I think, when I first went in 2015, I think it was more kind of a safety thing for them. It was more about security, he's, his background, is he perhaps, going to be problematic? And I think when I was last there, I actually went to Jordan for a few days, and I came back through the Allenby Bridge crossing, which kind of goes into kind of the West Bank and then up to towards Jerusalem. They were conscious of that I had been a BDS activist, and they were conscious of that I may be coming back to kind of partake in demonstrations and others in the West Bank. And luckily, in a sense that meant the reception I received was a lot firmer. It was extremely difficult to kind of, deal with them. Sometimes you get lucky, you get somebody that's understanding, who talks to you, who kind of wants to know about you. Others, they just get people who kind of think, oh, he's an Arab, he's a Muslim, or whatever, when I'm not even Arab in the first place. But, some people will attach labels to you. So it varied. But no, I was, in general, across the board, from all sorts of people, I was treated very, very well, I have to say.
Interesting you should say that people imagine that because you're Muslim, therefore you're an Arab, you must have been, as very often Jewish people find that those who aren't the brightest people here would actually question the fact, oh, if you're Jewish, you must have been born in Israel, which happens exactly. Relatively often. We have a question from, I'll bring in Jane Myers if you'd like to unmute yourself, Jane.
Hello, thank you very much, Ali. Really interesting. And I just wish we had more people like you that would stand up and open dialogue and have conversations. It's really interesting. I have a question. One thing I don't understand is when you say that Muslims are there to support their Muslim brothers around the world, which is why, there's so much focus in Israel. Why do we not see the support of Muslim countries to support what's going on in the with the Uyghur Muslims and other Muslims that have had atrocities done to them? You don't hear about that. All you hear about how Muslims are supporting the Palestinians in Israel, and that gets frustrating, and that doesn't square with me. If you're supposed to be supporting your Muslim brothers around the world, there's plenty of other countries that are doing nasty things to Muslims. Yeah, it's always Israel that seems to be the focus of the attention. And I had another question, if I can you also answer, I'm interested to know, I was at some of the protests at SodaStream in Brighton, and I would obviously be on the pro-Israel side. And my experience was very much the pro-Israel side are all peaceful and singing and music and food, of course. The other side was very vile in their words and their, language. What was your experience in outside the Kedem shop in Manchester? Because I'm interested to know if you ever found with the pro-Israel side whether they engage in that sort of language, because that's not what I experienced in Brighton.
Well, thank you for both the questions. I'm going to start with the second question that you've asked there. Interestingly, again, the way that you've kind of talked about the perception that you've had with yourself and the way that you conducted yourselves in Brighton, that was something that I believed at the time that I was doing, alongside the rest of the kind of the pro-Palestinian demonstrators. When it came to kind of confronting the pro-Israel side, it's fair to say that kind of both sides sort of threw insults at each other, would shout at each other. That was something that was custom there. But the methods in which we employed and others, at the time, I didn't think that they were necessarily, again, there was never an act of violence. There was never anything like that. There was always what I believed was a legitimate course of action. Again, some of the language I will concede that some of the language that was used there, if I had heard that now, I would honestly think twice and think, hold on a minute, that's not acceptable. And that was from both sides, in a sense, there was, and I think that is part and parcel of the protest, that, people get riled up, they get emotional, they get angry, and they say things that are, irrational and emotionally charged. Okay, and the question about sorry, David, you've got something going on there. He's muted himself. Perfect. Sorry. The question about kind of, why is it only Israel? I mean, I would say, actually, I think the response by a lot of Muslim organizations in this country to what's going on in China has been very, very good. I think that there has been there has been a call out by a lot of British Muslims, especially there was a recent vote in Parliament to recognize what's going on in China as genocide. That was something that was peddled by a lot of Muslim organizations. I think that actually now, there is kind of a move away from Israel, especially now that kind of countries within the Muslim Arab world are actually moving to recognize Israel. There is a move away from it. You know, I think that a lot of the time, you know, the discourse was toxified. I think one of the things that really draws attention to Israel a lot of the time is when big events happen. Like in 2014, you know, that was a full-scale war. That's why the discourse centered around that. But I think that, you know, again, and, you know, if we don't talk about the Muslim countries themselves, why they're not calling out China is, you know, is substantially down to the fact that there's self-interest at heart. You know, the fact that, in fact, I believe it was a combination of countries, Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Pakistan, a few others, had written an open letter kind of endorsing China's actions in Xinjiang. And many people within the British Muslim community were very critical, and including myself. So I think that there is a move away from that. Let's just focus on Israel as the bad guy. I think there is that for sure. And I think, especially even now, you know, looking at the contemporary politics of Israel, the fact that potentially the next government could have, you know, Arab parties, you know, potentially even an Arab Islamist party in the governing coalition is something that I think will radically shift the discourse. You know, I am very hopeful now. I think Yair Lapid has the mandate to form the next government. I am very hopeful on a personal level that he actually appoints an Arab minister. I think that will actually shift the discourse in a very positive light and actually show people, you know what, this is more than just black and white. You know, we have this, you know, this is our country. And I really hope that changes. Again, we'll see in the coming weeks, but I hope that answers both of your questions.
Thank you. Flora Frank, are you there? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, Ali. Can you hear me? Hi, Ali. I'm actually speaking from Israel, and I have a question to ask you. But before I ask you a question, it's so wonderful to be able to engage with you. And I appreciate what David Oliver said when he said, you know, Jews unfortunately don't mix very much with Muslims, etc. But as I said, I'm in Israel, and I take every opportunity. There are lots of Muslim, Arab, Palestinians, whatever you want to call them. They're all our brothers. Your father's right. We should be brothers and we should be at peace. I go out of my way. I've said this every time. People are boring, Flora, be quiet. I go out of my way. I think it has to start from grassroots. What you're doing is phenomenal, but we have to start. Ordinary person like that, on the street, smile, laugh, speak, thank you. If I see an Arab worker, I especially go out of my way and thank them when they're cleaning the roads or whatever it is, as there are Israeli workers who clean the roads. I just want to say that. But before I go, my question to you is this. And I felt very much what you said about the Israeli children and the Israeli Arab children or passers-by ignoring each other. And I want you to know there are many Israelis, maybe I'm exaggerating many, there are Israelis who go out of their way. There are Israelis who are on your side. You know, we have demonstrations. I mean, I tell them off because you're quite right. They haven't got a sense of history. They say, stop the occupation. I said, go home and learn your history and then you'll know. But anyway, I don't want to get political. My question to you is this. Do you know about the Board of Deputies of British Jews? Have you heard of it?
Yeah,
right.
Of course.
Have you heard of their Project Flag? Because I'm very involved with them. I've just had a meeting with them for 3 hours nearly. And there's a flagship project called Invest in Peace. And we go all over the country. We've been to Luton and Bradford and Blackburn and Leeds and Glasgow. And you tell me that, you know, we engage with Somali, Nigerians and Muslims. And they were the first ones with the Uyghurs. You know, they really highlighted their plight and tried to help them. We've had lots of. Now, why am I telling you this? Because this Invest in Peace, and I think you should be part of it. I mean, being very serious, because one particular example, I'll make it as quick as I can, but I think this is important. There was an Israeli, it really caught me. This is many years ago. We've had it now on Zoom, but we used to have proper meetings. There was an Israeli mother who came along because her son was killed by a terrorist. He was actually killed by an Arab terrorist, I have to say it. He was killed in Cologne. And there was an Israeli father who came, whose daughter was killed by an Israeli soldier. I think it was an accident because we don't normally go. I can't remember exactly, but whatever it was, each one suffered a tragic loss. And the mother of the Israeli soldier and the father of the Arab girl, very sadly, she was a young girl, they got together, they realized, what is this? and they've done amazing work. That's one example. There are many such, and I really think you would be an asset. And I'm asking you, please, to get in touch with the Board of Deputies. You can mention my name, Flora Frank, from the Community Issues Division, and that you would like to address the board. I will tell them as well, but I think we need people like you, because it's amazing what you're doing. And Hashem should bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you and grant us all peace, not just grant the Arabs, because that's what we're looking for. I've been here for 14 months because of COVID, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. I just want you to know there's somebody actually from Israel who has people on the what I call Yehuda v'Shomron, not the West Bank. Again, I don't want to be political.
Okay, thank you, Flora. We'll go to Ali now, and he can respond.
No, it's
before he forgets what the question was at the beginning.
Yeah.
And may I say something to you, Mr. Chairman? You must give us a chance to speak. Thank you. Thank you. And you have. I thank you very much. Wow. Thank you.
No, thank you. Wow, I don't know what to slow. That's very kind of you. Thank you for letting me know about that project. I haven't come across it myself. And if there is anything that you want to pass on to me afterwards as well, please. I think I think David has my email. He can pass on to you as well. But please feel free to get in touch with me. It's amazing that I'm grateful that you've called in from Israel as well, and I appreciate it must be quite late there, and I'm very glad that you've taken the opportunity and the chance to listen to me speak. And it's nice to know that, in a sense, that this message that I'm kind of trying to come out with, and the things that I'm kind of talking about now, that they are being realized on the ground. So in a sense, again, it's really reassuring for me to hear that, and I'm grateful that you've flagged that up for me. So thank you very, very much again.
David referred to somebody from Liverpool. Victor, are you there? If you would like to unmute yourself, Victor Huglin is with us from up north. Liverpool's close to Manchester, so.
Yes, it is. I was also at that demonstration at the Kedem shop many years ago. Right, thank you very much for allowing me to speak, and thank you also for being an excellent chairman and keeping control of people. You do an excellent job.
Thank you.
You were talking about students earlier on. From what I gather, students have three objectives. Firstly, to get a degree. Secondly, to party as much as they can. And thirdly, by and large, to get as drunk as they can on many occasions. How many students are actually interested in the Israel-Palestine dispute? How many people on the campuses have any interest whatsoever in this subject?
So it's a good summary of certain tenets of student life there. And thanks for your question, obviously. I mean, I think the one thing I would say you've missed out is you have that breed of students, all right? But I think that at the same time, there are groups of students that, engage heavily in forms of political activism. And that's just not simply isolated to Israel-Palestine. It can be on anything. It can be sort of local party politics. It can be student politics, it can be other things. But there is a breed of that. And I think that there are a group of students that are vested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the one thing I would question is in a sense, their motivations, and in that respect, I would kind of probably find a commonality with you, because for me, I see many students who sort of will go down to kind of JSOC events and kind of shout down speakers and others. And then I'm kind of asking myself, well, why are you there in the first place? What is your motivation is the key thing. Students being, my issue is not with people being interested. It's the question of what motivates you and why you're actually engaging with the issue in the first place. And, that cuts both ways, to say the least. I think that there are a lot of students who are genuinely, who share. I think there are people who share my mentality, that they actually want to foster peace, that they're working towards peace. And there are students who are there because they are kind of covering their own underlying prejudices and bigotry through activism and using that as a shield to kind of cover away from any form of criticism of the fact that at the core, they have some pretty bigoted views. And I do see that. And one of the things I'm critical of in some of the ways of student activism is the way it further polarizes people. If you take a sort of, take for example, you have a Jewish student, growing up in a Jewish family, not really actively politically involved, whatever, simply, has their own, sort of background of growing up as a British Jew in this country, and then goes onto university campus for the first time and is seeing all this stuff about Israel apartheid, and, is hearing this discourse that is obviously quite aggressive, which, for that person, when they're seeing people use terms like Israel and Jew so interchangeably, is ultimately then pushed into an environment where, they're feeling marginalized, intimidated. They ultimately will gravitate towards organizations and individuals who are basically perfect counterweights, who offer alternative narratives and others, but they, in a sense, then put themselves in another echo chamber of kind of the pro-Israel groups, because the pro-Palestinian groups, because the activism others, they've pushed them to that end where they kind of surround themselves with people that share, by and large, the same opinions, and that just further amplifies their extremities and the issues, and it further segregates and polarizes communities on campus. That for me is the tenet of the problem of the way activism is conducted. The way, I guess, you can amend that, and I've said it many, many times today, it's about creating honest, genuine, open dialogue, discussing the difficult questions, by all means, discussing those, addressing them coherently, giving everybody the platform and space to speak and articulate their own viewpoints in an honest, genuine manner, and being respectful, and creating that understanding is the key thing for me.
Whether it be nationality, religion, colour, football team, or whatever it might be, do you believe that people generally are inherently racist?
Oof, good question. Do I believe people are inherently racist? You know what? I'm going to give you a simple answer. I was going to give you a long-winded answer, but I'm going to say simple. No, I don't believe that at all. I do not. I believe people are not born racist. They're not born to hate. They're not born to dislike. There's a verse in the Quran that when I kind of think about a question like this, that I'm reminded of, which is that, God tells us, we created you in tribes and nations so that you may know one another. For me, that is the essence of coexistence that is promoted within Islam. And that is something that I think should be acknowledged as well. Again, this idea that we are somehow innately averse to those with differences, I think, is something that is engineered, it's fabricated, it's not natural. And I fundamentally believe that racism is not something that is simply you are born with it. It's something that is inherited, and it's something that your environment and the things that you expose yourself to will eventually kind of result in. So yes, I would say that, and it just kind of, to give you the short answer, no, I do not believe any human being is born racist.
Because there is, you've already expressed it, there is so much divisiveness in the world. And you've expressed that between Judaism and Islam, there is so much in common. And actually in life, we all as humans, no matter what, we have so much in common, but yet those tiny, tiny differences are what we concentrate on. And that's why there's so much hatred out there. And unfortunately, people like you are in the minority. And I wish there were more of you and of people who could be around, who could actually consciously take both sides in and actually look and discuss and actually try to understand why there are differences, why there are problems, rather than merely forming the view to take one side and not try to understand the other. And that just in itself creates hatred. Sorry, I'm just rambling, and I know David Oliver wants to come back in. So I'll bring him back in.
Yeah, I thought you thought I'd gotten home somewhere, but anyway, I think it's 9:15 now, so I think you're all getting a bit tired. So I'll leave you on a slightly different somewhere where we're going. How do you think the future of our new peace? I asked the chief rabbi of UAE, and the question I asked him, have you ever met him? Rabbi Bastana. Anyway, he's taken over the whole of the UAE. And I said to him, you know, most Jewish people don't want to go to the Arab countries for obvious reasons. A lot of people, apart from the Israelis, but I mean, there are people starting to queue up to get there. I asked him a question, and I said to him very openly, he was obviously the chief rabbi there, and I just said to him, you know, I've never had any intentions of going to any Arab countries at all, as you can imagine, obviously. I had no feelings to go there, it just didn't do anything for me. His answer, and he's a very serious rabbi, you know, he's a very, he's the only young man, well, I think so anyway. But his answer was absolutely sensational. He said it's the most fantastic place in there. He started telling us about, you know, how many Jewish people are actually living there. And he said there are people in the universities, but a lot of people come over from Israel, but that's something else. And he said you must go. It's unbelievable. He said I've been traveling on the 3 countries, and he said I've never ever found any problems at all. I mean, there are, you know, we have very religious Jews, not so religious Jews, and the religious Jews, you can tell them a mile off because their garb and everything else. And I find I was, I don't really want to say I was shocked, but I was shocked. So hopefully, I mean, how do you see it now? What's happening?
Okay, I'm going to respond to this in twofold. So this, I mean, I understand sort of the reasons as to why in the past there's been fears about going to Arab countries, but you know, this is something that I think almost that what annoys me is this perception that, you know, that somehow Jews are the enemies, if you like, that is held by certain extremists, I would call them, and you know, especially people within my own community, the Muslim community, who seek to kind of push that narrative. I have a huge problem with, you know, just it doesn't take an extensive look through history to know that, you know, Islam and Judaism have always had, you know, extensively, you know, in a sense, a good history in the wake of, you know, Jews had active participation within Muslim societies, you know, that even on a religious and theological basis, there's always been an element of respect. And, you know, the anti-Semitism that you see in the Middle East is not innate to and is not born out of Islamic theology. You know, if you read the literature, people like, you know, Sayyid Qutb, who was kind of the ideological backbone behind the Muslim Brotherhood, or, you know, Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, the anti-Semitism which they actually promote completely alludes to and engages with age-old European anti-Semitic tropes. The ideas of, for example, you know, Jews being manipulative, controlling the world and others, you know, Jews being the reason behind, you know, society's demise and decline, you know, spreading diseases, all these other kind of intricate things that have existed. You know, these are things they talk about. You know, they don't justify their anti-Semitism through religion or anything else, and that's what I find is so frustrating about this whole thing. And that actually, you know, one of the things I'm grateful for in the sense that there is a country like the UAE to some, you know, that has, you know, a very diverse religious community as well. You know, you have Jews, you have Christians, you know, have the only Mormon community in the Middle East, I believe. I'm fairly sure in the UAE is there as well. I mean, it's something that really, for me, I think, you know, this conflict needs to be divorced away from this mentality that it's a Jewish-Muslim conflict, because it really isn't. This idea of peace, that you know, that the fact that this idea that peace somehow needs to be achieved between Muslims and Jews, I think is not the truth. The reality is that it's not peace that needs to be achieved, it's understanding. It's basic understanding of history. It's basic understanding of the fact that, you know, the religions, the theology are so similar in others. I mean, if we want to talk about peace between Israelis and the Palestinians, that is a whole nother kettle of fish. That's something that has to be sorted on a political level. And, you know, that is something that has to be dealt with with people on the ground who are going to make those decisions. So in that respect, I think, you know, the peace in that particular realm is something that is a lot harder to find. It's more elusive because it is dependent upon the extent to which the politicians, the others who are in positions of power, Israel, the PA, Hamas, etc., will come together and negotiate a solution. But I think this idea that, you know, peace needs to be resolved and peace within sort of the sphere of the Arab, Muslim world and the Jewish world needs to be kind of reconciled, I think, is an anathema. It's not correct for me. It's this idea that we're in conflict. I reject, and I will always reject the notion that this is a religious issue. And I will always fundamentally push for the notion that, you know, religious coexistence should never be something that is seen as a luxury, or it should just simply be seen as a requirement and as a basic requirement that all individuals should be respected, and that, you know, we should ultimately foster the similarities that we have as well.
Okay, I think I really don't know what to say. I mean, we could have actually gone on until midnight or even one.
Probably.
I've got a list here that I get tired just reading it. But anyway, I thought you were excellent. I wouldn't dream about asking you back again. And it was wonderful, because we haven't had anybody like you at all. It's, you know, 95 are Jewish, but we want to try and get a little bit outside of the world. So anyway, thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me.
Okay, I'll send you the link of this meeting, so you can always do whatever you want to do with it.
Thank you.
I listen to them 2 or 3 times over a week. It's really good. So can I now pass? Oh, just to remind everybody, and we'll keep everything open afterwards, including you if you want to, Ellie. And we're having a l'chaim, and that means to health. We do like drinking, but mostly whiskey. So yeah. David has actually organised something, and he's told me that it's best, more or less one of the best, the whiskies in the world. So thank you, David.
I can confirm it is very nice. Unfortunately, no one's allowed round here, and I can't go out. So there you go. That's life at the moment. If I could just say, Ali, thank you very much. Very interesting. And it's been a pleasure meeting you. And
thank you again.
It's always a pleasure speaking to somebody with an open mind. And it's no matter what the subject's coming from, but it's always nice to be able to have clear discussion and understanding. And as you say, it's not peace that necessarily will come first, but it's understanding that is a requirement. I'd like to thank everybody else for coming here this evening. There aren't many of you left, but if I could just tell you, the next Wednesday evening is next week itself, from the 10th to the 16th of May, is Mental Health Awareness Week. And we have a speaker from Raphael coming on next Wednesday evening. Her name is Sarah Cooper. She is the clinical director of Raphael and has been since 2009. Raphael has been providing counselling and wellbeing services to the community since 1979. Should be extremely interesting. There have been certainly mental health issues have unfortunately escalated over the last year with the problems through the pandemic and people just dealing with it at a general level. So please join us next week. It should be a very interesting evening. I will now pass back to David, who is, I believe, just pouring the drinks and cutting the cake. And thank you again, Ali. As I say, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I hope to meet you
for having
very
me.
soon.
Yeah, thanks again. I do have to take off, unfortunately, as I've got to head down to open my fast and see my family. But I'm really grateful again. Thank you so much.